What's the Shabbos before Pesach called?
Shabbat HaGadol.
Shabbos HaGadol, right? The Great Shabbos. Why is it called the Great Shabbos?
Great Shabbos before I left Egypt.
So it's the Great Shabbos before they left Egypt, okay.
For those?
Some people, before they left Egypt.
Oh.
Some people will tell you that it's because the rabbi is supposed to give a great big drosha on the Shabbos before Pesach, because he's got to go through all the. I'm just warning you. I'm just preparing you in advance, because you've got to go through all the halachas, all the things that you need to know for Pesach for practical purposes. But that's not the true reason. The true reason is, as is quoted in the Shulchan Aruch, including the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch, is that when the Jews left Egypt, they left on a Thursday, which implies that the Shabbos beforehand was the 10th of Nisan. Does anybody know what happened on the 10th of Nisan in the story of the Exodus? You absolutely do. You just don't know that it was that. You don't remember that it was on the 10th of Nisan, but for sure you know what happened.
Did you mention about the lambs?
Oh, there we go. They took the lambs. So Hashem told Moshe to tell the Jewish people that everybody's got to take a lamb and they've got to tie it to their bedpost and they've got to keep it there for 4 days. And then they were to slaughter the lamb and make what was essentially going to be the first Pesach sacrifice, even before they left Egypt. So if they did this on the 14th of Nisan, then that means that they took the lamb on the 10th of Nisan. So the 10th of Nisan, there's this whole big to-do happening in Egypt, as you can well imagine, because the Egyptians, as we well know, were idolaters. And they were polytheists. They had many gods. One of the things that they worshipped was Ares. And Ares is obviously represented by the lamb. So can you imagine now, here you have these people watching Jewish people en masse, hundreds and thousands of Jewish people taking lambs through the streets on a lead. Obviously it must have aroused some curiosity. So people started to interview the Jews, well, what's going on? What are you doing with the lambs? Where are you taking them? And the Jews told them, we're taking the lambs home. We're going to keep them for 4 days. And then in 4 days' time, we're going to slaughter these lambs. Okay, so that was already very unsettling, as you can imagine, for the Egyptians, because this was a tremendous affront to their beliefs. But then it got worse, because then the Jews told them, by the way, in 4 days' time, when we slaughter these lambs, that night Hashem is going to kill the firstborn Egyptians. Now, at this stage of the game, anything that the Jews warn the Egyptians about, any thinking Egyptians should take seriously. In the beginning, when they said the river's going to turn to blood, it sounded a little far-fetched. But now there are 9 plagues in, and every prediction has been 100% accurate. So they know that this is not something you play around with. And so what happens is, the firstborns hear the story, and they realize that their lives are on the line. So the firstborns send a delegation to Pharaoh and to the leaders of Egypt, including their own parents, and they say, listen, we can't play around any longer. You have to let the Jewish people go, because if you don't, we're all going to die. And in their minds, they think that this is a very safe and strong argument, because Pharaoh himself is a firstborn, so surely he should be as panicked as they are.
Sorry, Rabbi. Did they know beforehand that they were going to leave on the 14th of Nisan?
They knew that they were going to leave after the story of the Pesach sacrifice. They didn't necessarily know that it was going to be on the not the 14th, on the 15th, because the 14th they were going to slaughter it. At night they were going to eat it, and the next day they were going to leave. But it's not necessarily that they knew exactly which point they were going to leave. They just knew it was going to be the death of the firstborns, and then they were going to go. So here they are, they're telling everybody's panicking, and they go to their fathers, they go to Pharaoh, and they say, let the Jewish people go. Pharaoh says, absolutely not, under no circumstances. So now they really start to panic, and they start an uprising against the leaders of Egypt, and it turns into a full-out civil war, and many, many Egyptians were killed on that Shabbos. not just ordinary Egyptians. The people who were killed were the leadership. These were very important people. So it was a very significant moment in the story. And like I mentioned last night in Shul, we actually say this on Shabbos morning when we do what we call the Great Hallel on Shabbos morning. We actually say this: Lemakei Mitzrayim biva choreihem, that Hashem smote the Egyptians with their firstborns, rather than saying Hashem smote their firstborns. The implication is that he got the firstborns to attack the Egyptians, which is exactly what happened. That's why it's considered a very great miracle, because it's a miracle for Hashem to attack the Egyptians. It's a greater miracle for Hashem to get the Egyptians to attack the Egyptians. So that's considered a great miracle. Because it's considered a great miracle, therefore the date on which this miracle happened, which was the Shabbos before Pesach, becomes known as Shabbos HaGadol, the Great Shabbos. Now there's a very obvious question that you have to ask. Very obvious question. What's the obvious question?
What's happening now?
Fine. That's not an obvious. That's an observation, not a question. But what's the obvious question? Very obvious question.
It's obvious because you know it's obvious.
It's a very obvious question. Think about it. Think about it. When we celebrate Pesach just a few days later, do we celebrate the Thursday of Pesach or do we celebrate the 15th of Nisan? The 15th of Nisan. It's not on a Thursday every year, it's on a Thursday every few years. When you celebrate the giving of the Torah on Shavuos, which was also on a Shabbos, so do we celebrate a Shabbos at the beginning of the month of Sivan, or do we celebrate the 6th of Sivan? 6th of Sivan, right? When we celebrate the miracle of Purim or the miracle of Hanukkah, we don't even know what day of the week it was. It's completely irrelevant. So when do we celebrate it? On the date that it happened, the 14th of Adar or the 25th of Kislev. Why don't we celebrate this great miracle if it is such a great miracle, to the extent that we say that it's part of the great praise that we give to Hashem, ki la'olam chastoi, that Hashem's kindness is forever? How come we don't celebrate this on the date that it happened, the 10th of Nisan? Why do we celebrate it on the Shabbos before Pesach?
This, I would say, is because this must be the first great Shabbos that the Jews had as one.
But they didn't.
No?
No, because they weren't given the laws of Shabbos yet.
Yeah, that's what I think.
So there was no celebration of Shabbos. There's no Shabbos component to the story other than the fact that it was on the day of the week of Shabbos. But there was no concept of keeping Shabbos yet. So that's what I'm saying. It's an obvious question, because whenever you commemorate an event, you commemorate it on the date that it happened, not the day of the week. So why is this an exception that we celebrate it specifically on the day of the week, which very often is not the date? For example, last year, Shabbos HaGadol was Erev Pesach. Right? Pesach started Saturday night. So it was a very different date to what it was then. Right?
The last Shabbos that we spent in Egypt, maybe.
Fine, but why is that called the Great Shabbos?
So Rob, that's a very good question, but it wasn't obvious to me.
I don't find it obvious either. I'm glad I've got some.
I would imagine, I would have thought it would have immediately caught your attention that why you're not celebrating the date that this happened. By the way, when is Pesach this year?
Wednesday night.
In other words, this year, Shabbos HaGadol will be on the correct date.
On the Thursday.
This it will be on Shabbos. The 10th of Nisan will be on Shabbos. So this year it all works. Everything falls into place. So you have the Shabbos HaGadol, and it's the 10th of Nisan. So this year we don't have to panic about the discrepancy between the date and the day.
How long is it? A 19-year thing?
No, it's every few years.
Thinking that as well.
It's more
Jeff, I
frequent
was
than that.
thinking of you now.
So now the question is,
Don't go
why?
buy ships and take it home and tie it to your bed this year. I'm telling your wife I don't appreciate. She doesn't understand.
So the big question is, why the Shabbos and not the date? If you have a look in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, he gives a suggestion for why this is. Many years later, 40 years later, on the 10th of Nisan, the Jewish people had a very sad event that happened. And what was the sad event 40 years later? The 10th of Nisan is the passing of Miriam, Moshe's sister. and now it's obviously her Yortzeit. And we don't do it. But there are many communities who have a custom that they fast on a Yortzeit, including the Yortzeits of certain great people.
Even
Right.
if it's a Shabbat.
Okay, that's a different question. Okay, but and probably not. So it's not so straightforward. But let's just say that if it's during the week and you're going to be fasting, as many communities did for the Yortzeit of Miriam, it's a bit strange to have a fast day and a celebration on the same date. So to accommodate that paradox, they said we'll leave the 10th of Nisan to be the Yortzeit, and people will fast on that date. When it coincides with the Shabbos, then certainly for the Yortzeit of Tzaddik, you're not going to fast. So now you can have the celebration on the Shabbos. And that's how it came to be, that the Shabbos is celebrated rather than the date. That is the simple answer that is offered. And it's a perfectly fine answer except for one thing, which is, can you really fiddle with the date that something happened just because it's not convenient? I recently heard a story of a family, it's not exactly the same, but a family who felt one year that because of circumstances, whatever, Pesach was very inconvenient for them. So they decided they're going to have the Seder at lunch instead of doing the Seder at night. Right? Because it's inconvenient. You can't do these things, right? It's not how Judaism works. You don't just shift something around because it's not so comfortable. So, okay, it's her Yortzeit, and it's not the happiest day for the Jewish people. But the fact is that the miracle, which is supposed to be such a great miracle, that we call the Shabbos the great Shabbos because of the great miracle, surely such a great miracle should still be able to have its day. Why do we shift it to Shabbos? As is often the case in Judaism, if you want to understand something, you actually have to dig a little deeper than the way things present at the surface. So if you want to understand why it is that this particular celebration is tethered to a day of the week rather than to a day of the month, then obviously you've got to try and understand what is the difference between the days of the week and the days of the month.
I thought you were going to divert tomorrow to Friday to your day.
It's too early to divert.
We got time.
So you've got to understand what's the difference between days of the week and days of the month. Now we have a big clue about this because this past Shabbos we read HaChodesh, which is where the days of the month were introduced for the first time. So if you want to understand the symbolism or the significance of the days of the week and the days of the month, that would be a good place to start when the days of the months were introduced. Now, before Hashem gave the Jewish people the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, which is that you're supposed to track the moon, and when you see the new moon, you're supposed to announce it, and then it becomes Rosh Chodesh, etc. Before any of that happened, were there months?
No. It had to be. Wow.
Planted.
You know, that's seasons.
That's seasons.
But months, you have a new moon, the moon waned and
But were there
waxed.
months? Did they have months?
No, you saw a new moon, like a new moon.
It's an interesting question, right? It's an interesting question. So
It's not obvious either, Rabbi.
this is not obvious. This one is not obvious. So we have evidence that there were months. We have evidence that there was a way to track months, even if it wasn't the identical way to how we track it now, because during the flood we are told that Noach went into the ark on a date of the month, right? And then on the 17th day of the second month, he went into that's when the rain began, and then we're told when it ended. So we have evidence that there was a way to track the months even before the mitzvah of HaChodesh. So the question then is, what changed when we were given the mitzvah of the months and the cycles, if there were already months and cycles? And I'll take it from a different angle. It's irrelevant whether or not humans tracked the months. The fact is, months existed. As you say, the cycle of the moon was there as a natural phenomenon, regardless of whether somebody was tracking it or not. You know, just because nobody's got a calendar doesn't mean there are no months. In the same way as we have the various astrological signs that we associate with the months, those astrological signs are part of the natural order. It's just a matter of whether people recognize them or not.
Well, that's the point. They're not anything that param until from the perspective of the person who assigns that meaning.
Well, is that true?
I would say that's teleological. It's like
But I'm saying if Hashem
So the-
assigns meaning to something, then is it relevant if we don't, as humans, assign meaning to it?
volition,
Wasn't the point that
free will.
Hashem also has free will.
No, but we don't have free will.
No, we do. Hashem gives us free will. Anyway,
You don't get free will to decide whether it's a new month or not. You only get free will to decide whether you're going to notice if there's a new month or
Maybe you're
not.
going to bless the new man.
Whether you're going to bless the new month. You don't get to choose if there'll be a new month or not.
so something has meaning outside of us.
Yeah.
Anything, celestial beings, blah blah blah, anything. And
Well,
then-
again, he has another perspective. The Rambam is of the view, and he writes this in his book of laws rather than his book of philosophy, that certain of the celestial beings have awareness. So whatever that means, but the fact is that it's not purely we who are the sentient beings who determine meaning. Okay, it's a subject for another whole
Always meaning
conversation.
from our perspective. So there's meaning from that perspective.
Okay.
And meaning from our perspective.
So it's a subject for a much bigger conversation than what we have now. So the Midrash says this on the parasha that we just read, this past Shabbos, the special reading of HaChodesh. So the Midrash says this: when Hashem created His world, the language is very, very interesting. When Hashem created His world, so it doesn't say that Hashem created His world in the Midrash. That's why I say the language is interesting. The Midrash says, "Mishe bochar HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'olamoi." When Hashem chose His world, you hear the difference? It's not that He just created His world. It was an intentional decision. He chose to create His world.
What's the word chose in Hebrew?
Mishe bochar, like bechira,
Yes.
to choose. So Mishe from when bochar, Hashem chose His world. Then what did He do? Kava boy Rosh Chadashim v'Shonim. So Hashem established in the system of the world that there should be Rosh Chodesh and that there should be years. In other words, the cycles that we either plan our lives around or that we sanctify, depending on all of those cycles were already in place from the time that Hashem created the world. And those cycles effectively are three major cycles: weeks, months, and years. Now, obviously, a week is made up of days, so you could say it's days, weeks, months, and years, right? But the point that's relevant for the Midrash is months and years. That's really what the Midrash focuses on. That Hashem set up cycles of months and of years. Then the Midrash continues. Mi shek bochar beYaakov uvanav, when Hashem chose Yaakov and his children, in other words, the children of Israel, in other words, the story that we just read about in Parashas HaChodesh, the first mitzvah that Hashem gave to the Jewish people at the time that He was going to take them out of Egypt, which is when Hashem chose the Jewish people as His nation. Then, Kov HaBoy Chodesh Shel Geula. Then Hashem introduced a month of redemption. That's how the Midrash puts it. Even though the Midrash is commenting on the idea that we were given a mitzvah to track the months of the year and to therefore have a Rosh Chodesh, and based on that, etc., to set up the whole system of our calendar. But it's interesting that the Midrash frames it as a month of redemption. That was the big chiddush, that was the big innovation of the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. Okay, very, very interesting. Either way, what we do see is this: out of the four possible cycles, days, weeks, months, and years, months behave differently to the other three cycles. In other words, a day is a 24-hour period. Now, halachically, the way that 24-hour period behaves depends on the time of the year. So, therefore, the earliest time that you can daven, the latest time that you can say Shema, what time you have to finish Mincha, what time Shabbos comes in, all of those things are obviously going to shift based on the times of the year. But the day itself remains a 24-hour period. It's just a question within those 24 hours, how many hours are dark, how many hours are light. And that's going to have halachic implications. But a day is always 24 hours. How do we know that? Because the Torah tells us right in the beginning, the story of creation, Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Boiker, that it's evening and it is morning, and you put that together and you get Yom. You get a day, whether it's Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, etc. That's what makes a day. So that's the cycle of a day. It's fixed. The cycle of a week is fixed, because the cycle of the week is 7 24-hour periods. And they're also named Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, until you get to Yom Shvi'i, which is Shabbos. You get to the seventh day, and that concludes the cycle. We know that because when Hashem creates the world, He creates in that cycle of 7 days. Once that has happened, that's it. Now you reset and you start again. We say this in our davening because every single day when we do what is called the Shir Shal Yom, the song for the day, we say today is day 1 from Shabbos, day 2 from Shabbos. Right? We don't say that it's day 13 from Rosh Chodesh, because we are acknowledging that the cycle of the week is a repeating cycle. Same thing with a year. A year is a repeating cycle, and this is interesting because you said before about planting. So one of the key features of a year is that a year is comprised of 4 seasons. It's one of the key features. So even though a year might be slightly longer, slightly shorter, depending on exactly how things are, but a solar year rarely has a leap. And when it has a leap year, it's an extra day. That's the correction is minimal, because it's essentially the same cycle that repeats itself again and again and again. A month is a very different concept, because once Hashem gave us the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, since then a month is not purely just an astronomical feature. How long does it take for this lunar cycle to complete itself? Once we have a mitzvah to establish a calendar, then the month is undetermined until somebody sees the new moon. And then if nobody sees the new moon, then we rely on the fact that there's a lunar cycle that cannot be longer than 30 days. And then we impose a Rosh Chodesh onto the community, because you can't stretch a lunar cycle longer than what it's intended to be. But you never know where you stand in a lunar cycle. Today it's different, because today we don't have the Sanhedrin, and therefore we have a fixed calendar that's based purely on astronomical calculation. But the mitzvah, the original version of the mitzvah, the way the mitzvah is ideally fulfilled, is that you don't know the nature of the month until it is declared, which means, and I know this would be highly anxiety-provoking for many of the women in the community. Imagine not knowing exactly what day Pesach is going to be until 2 weeks before Pesach. It could be that Pesach's on Tuesday night, could be it's on Wednesday night. Right? We just have it fixed that it's on Wednesday night. But it could have been different. Right? So imagine living like that. So that tells you that a month is a cycle that is always in flux, or if you wish, always full of surprises. Now you can see that in the word. The word for a month is chodesh, which comes from the word chadash, which is new, or the word chidush, which is something unexpected. As opposed to the word shana, which is a year, which actually means to repeat, because a year is a repeating cycle. Okay? So if we were to compare, what we're looking at is, why do we celebrate a date on the day of the week versus the day of the month? So essentially what we're saying is, why are we choosing to celebrate this particular festival, or it's not even a festival, this particular miracle, the miracle of the uprising of the Egyptian firstborns? Why are we celebrating that associated with the day of the week, which is a predictable cycle, and not on the day of the month, which is where our normal Yom Tov sit, which is an unpredictable cycle? So there's your first clue between the difference between what weekdays represent and what days of the month represent, to help us understand why this particular event is commemorated on Shabbos HaGadol rather than the 10th of Nisan. And now that's going to be on Friday.